This afternoon with Dennis Kelleher, leader of Better Markets in Washington, D.C. Dennis has done a tremendous amount of work, first as a private attorney, then working in the United States Congress, particularly at the time of Dodd-Frank, and now runs Better Markets that he and Mike Masters founded and fighting the good fight on financial markets. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. There was no one in the financial reform space at the time. There was no one actually to provide a counterweight in the legal and policy-making process in Washington to the power, might, and money of Wall Street.
And just for those who are not so familiar with the process, Dodd-Frank wasn't passed like a detailed recipe book. It was punted to committees of rulemakers where the ongoing process you're describing, where there was no counterweight, was what you might call flesh out what the bill was to become.
Well, that's exactly right. You know, most big laws like Dodd-Frank are not self-executing. No matter how long the law might be, it really provides a framework. The way I talk about it is you think of it as a skeleton, but it has to be fleshed out. And it gets fleshed out in the regulatory agencies and ultimately in the courts. And the financial industry, with all its lobbyists and the revolving door and its campaign finance and all its purchased academics and influencers, are expert at playing the rulemaking, policy-making process in Washington and of course, all the army of lawyers in the subsequent litigation. And when Dodd-Frank was passed, a prominent Wall Street lobbyist or the head of one of their trade groups, a reporter said to him, "Boy, that's some defeat, the fact that a big financial reform law was passed." And he kind of laughed and he said, "Defeat?" He said, "This is halftime, baby. Now's when we go to work." Yeah. And what he meant was it now goes from a highly visible, highly covered activity in the legislative process to the dark corners in the back rooms of the regulators. And the regulators are at the SEC, the CFTC, the Fed, the OCC, the FDA, places that nobody hears about, that you don't see in the papers, and that the nightly news does not cover, right? Because it's really the substantive, detailed fighting over how the financial reform law was going to actually be implemented to either protect the American people or protect the profits of the financial industry. And at that, when I was leaving the Senate, the only army on the field was the army to protect the profits of the financial industry. So myself and Mike Masters, who is a successful hedge fund manager and very public-spirited guy.
He's American, from Atlanta, Georgia.
He's from Atlanta, Georgia. Yeah. He believes in markets, and he believes markets are some of the best mechanisms in the world for prosperity, including broad-based prosperity, but like everything else, they need guardrails. There needs to be rules of the road for the financial industry, both to keep it within the law, but also to maintain the faith, trust, and confidence of the American people in our financial system. Yes. And he felt that, having been an advocate for sensible financial reform, he thought there should be an organization that was a substantive counterweight to the lobbying of Wall Street that represented just the public interest. It wasn't talking its book. It wasn't trying to maximize revenues or profits or bonuses in a particular aspect of the industry, but just solely focused on the public interest. So Mike Masters and I founded Better Markets in the fall of 2010, months after Dodd-Frank was passed, to participate in the policymaking process, to try and have the law implemented to the maximum extent to protect the American people, while importantly, having a robust financial system that financed the real economy. I mean, after all, a lot of people like to denigrate finance and denigrate Wall Street, but the truth is every one of us needs a robust financial system that lends to small, medium, and large businesses, that looks at the entrepreneur and gives them money and loans them money and enables them to actually start a business, grow a business, employ people. We all need a robust financial system, but what we need is a financial system that supports the real economy rather than largely a gambling system that enriches a few thousand financiers at the expense of everybody else. And what the Dodd-Frank law was meant to do and intended to do was to prevent that from happening and to channel those activities into lending to the real economy in a way that didn't destabilize the financial system or risk a Great Depression and a crash like '08, while at serving the needs of the American people so that we can have broad-based prosperity, so that we can reduce inequality, so that people can achieve the American dream. We need that. We need a robust financial system focused on those values and principles. And that's what Dodd-Frank's about. And that's frankly what Better Markets fights for in the regulatory process, in the rulemaking process. We just do it kind of in a very detailed, substantive way. We've participated in just shy of 300 rulemakings now, more than really virtually anybody. I mean, even the biggest trade groups for Wall Street and some of the banks, as a standalone, probably more than almost anybody in 35 litigations. And what we're trying to do is make sure that the system works for the unprotected, works for the many, not just a few. Kind of the fraudulent business and the gaming of the system in Washington, that's what finance really is more expert at that than I believe derivatives and anything else they claim expertise in. And that's one of the things we do at Better Markets. And what we try and do is meet them head on at all the regulatory agencies, or wherever we can. We're pretty small, and funded, we're a pure 501c3. We're funded by, public-spirited people. They have literally unlimited resources. There are over 30 trade groups in Washington, D.C., 30, year in and year out, that spend hundreds of millions of dollars doing nothing but promoting the interest of finance in the Washington lawmaking, policymaking process.
Yep. And when I have to say, I worked for 6 years in the Senate, including Senate Banking Committee, and I've worked in the private sector in finance. And as I watch this unfolding, I see you as someone who's got technical expertise in relation to finance and law related to finance, knowledge about the money and politics system, knowledge about how public relations is used and studies are used and so forth, and about the process, the regulatory process, the enforcement process, all the different dimensions. And what concerns me is I have a lot of very well-meaning friends who open their checkbooks and give money to politicians. And I guess what I would allege is if they gave money to Better Markets rather than politicians, the leverage they would get from that would have a much greater impact than their campaign donations at this point in our republic.